In the muffled roar of explosions, the morning was covered in thick smoke and torn earth. Amidst the mud and the distant boom, a fainted soldier slid across the muddy ground, abandoned to his fate. He breathed in short gasps, his face covered in blood and dust, his hand trembling in a vain plea. But the response came cold, the dry sound of footsteps walking away, swallowed by the mist. Then through the grey gloom, a figure emerged. 4 firm paws, lively eyes, a German shepherd. The animal advanced in silence, its snout raised, as if it were the only one to hear that clamor. A short bark broke the air, and for a moment the field stood still. But what happens next? No one there could anticipate. Love stories with animals. Then subscribe now and don't miss a single one. Thank you for following us. Now let's return to our story. The thunderous explosion ripped through the Arizona desert training ground, sending clouds of red dust and debris skyward. Jake Morrison felt the ground give way beneath his boots before his body registered the pain. The force of the blast threw him backward, his helmet flying off as he crashed onto the scorched earth. Through the ringing in his ears, he could hear distant shouts, the mechanical whir of helicopters somewhere overhead, and the crackling of fires that had erupted from the training exercise gone catastrophically wrong. His hands clawed at the dirt, trying to find purchase to push himself up, but his body refused to cooperate. Jake's vision blurred, swimming between consciousness and darkness. He tried to call out, his voice emerging as a hoarse rasp that barely carried beyond his own ears. The acrid smell of smoke filled his lungs, making each breath a struggle. Around him, the chaos of the military training exercise continued, but he felt strangely isolated, as if the world had moved on without him. "Help!" he managed to whisper, the word dissipating into the hot desert air. "Someone, please." The Fort Huachuca training facility sprawled across thousands of acres, and Jake had been participating in what should have been a routine explosive ordnance disposal drill. But something had gone terribly wrong. The simulated IED had detonated with far more force than intended, and now he lay in a crater of his own making, abandoned by the retreat of his unit, who hadn't seen him fall in the confusion of smoke and panic. Time seemed to stretch and contract simultaneously. Jake couldn't tell if seconds or minutes had passed. His training told him to stay calm, to assess his injuries, to follow protocol. But his training hadn't prepared him for this overwhelming sense of helplessness. This terrifying realization that in the midst of dozens of soldiers, he might as well have been completely alone. Through the gray-brown haze of smoke, a shape began to emerge. At first, Jake thought his oxygen-deprived brain was conjuring illusions, but the form grew clearer with each passing second. It wasn't another soldier. It wasn't a medic rushing to his aid. It was a dog, a German shepherd, moving with purposeful strides through the devastation. The military working dog's coat was matted with dust and soot, but its eyes were alert, focused, scanning the terrain with the practiced vigilance of a trained guardian. Jake recognized the distinctive harness of a military K9 unit, but couldn't place which handler the dog belonged to. The animal navigated the debris field with surprising grace, its powerful body moving around twisted metal and smoldering equipment. As the dog drew closer, Jake's heart, which had been racing with fear, found a strange steadiness. There was something in the animal's demeanor, a sense of purpose that transcended mere training. The German shepherd paused a few feet away, head tilted, assessing Jake with an intelligence that seemed almost human. Then with deliberate care, the dog approached, lowering its head to sniff at Jake's injuries. The touch of the dog's cold nose against his arm sent a jolt through Jake's system, not of pain, but of connection. Here, in this moment of absolute vulnerability, when human help had failed to arrive, a different kind of savior had appeared. The dog's warm breath against his skin was oddly comforting, a reminder that he wasn't completely alone in this hellscape of smoke and fire. "Good boy," Jake managed to croak, his voice barely audible. His hand trembled as he reached up, fingers brushing against the dog's chest. The name tag on the harness read Duke in bold letters, and beneath it a handler's name he couldn't quite make out through his blurred vision. Duke didn't pull away. Instead, the dog settled beside him, its body providing a windbreak against the desert heat and floating ash. The animal's presence was more than physical. It was a lifeline to Hope, a testament that he hadn't been completely forgotten. Jake's fingers found their way to Duke's thick fur, gripping gently as if anchoring himself to reality. The sounds of the training ground continued around them, but they seemed to exist in a bubble of their own. Duke's ears swiveled, constantly alert to changes in their environment. When footsteps approached from the wrong direction, the dog's low growl warned them away. When equipment shifted and threatened to collapse, Duke's body tensed, ready to move Jake if necessary. Minutes crawled by, each one feeling like an eternity. Jake's strength was fading, the initial surge of adrenaline giving way to a bone-deep exhaustion. His grip on Duke loosened, and he felt himself starting to slip away into darkness. But just as unconsciousness threatened to claim him, Duke raised his head and released a sharp, commanding bark that cut through the chaos like a knife. The bark echoed across the training ground, a sound so distinctive and urgent that it couldn't be ignored. Duke barked again, and then again, each vocalization carrying a message of distress that any military personnel would recognize. The dog was trained for search and rescue, and now those instincts had taken over, transforming Duke from a passive companion into an active beacon. Jake heard the change in the sounds around them. Footsteps running this time coming closer, voices calling out coordinates, the mechanical beep of communication devices. Duke had done what Jake couldn't do for himself, had called for help when human voice failed. The rescue team appeared through the smoke, like ghosts materializing from another realm. Jake recognized Sergeant Martinez first, his weathered face etched with concern. Behind him came Corporal Johnson and Private Chen, carrying medical equipment and a stretcher. But what struck Jake, even in his compromised state, was that none of them looked at him first. Their eyes went to Duke, standing sentinel over his broken body, refusing to move even as the medics approached. "Good God," Martinez breathed, dropping to his knees beside Jake. "Morrison, can you hear me? Hang on, soldier. We've got you." Duke stepped back only slightly, allowing the medics access but maintaining his vigil. The dog's intelligent eyes tracked every movement, every piece of equipment that came near Jake. When Martinez reached for Jake's arm to check his pulse, Duke's hackles rose slightly, a protective instinct overriding his training for just a moment. "Easy, boy," Johnson said softly, recognizing the dog's protective stance. "We're here to help him." As if understanding, Duke relaxed marginally, but his focus never wavered from Jake. The medics worked quickly, assessing injuries, stabilizing, preparing for transport. Jake drifted in and out, catching fragments of their urgent conversations, medical terminology that floated past his comprehension. What he did understand, with crystal clarity, was Duke's unwavering presence. Even as they lifted him onto the stretcher, even as they began the careful extraction from the blast zone, the German shepherd remained at his side. The dog's training should have sent him back to his handler, but something stronger kept Duke tethered to this fallen soldier he'd found in the smoke. The journey to the medical tent felt endless. Each jostle of the stretcher sent waves of pain through Jake's body, but Duke's steady pace beside them provided an odd comfort. The dog seemed to know when to slow down, when to alert them to obstacles in their path. More than once, Duke's warning growl prevented them from taking a route that would have been dangerous for the stretcher. Sergeant Martinez kept glancing at the dog with an expression Jake couldn't quite read, a mixture of wonder and something deeper, almost reverent. "I've never seen anything like this," Martinez muttered to Johnson. "Duke's handler is on the other side of the compound. The dog shouldn't even be in this sector." "Maybe he heard the explosion," Johnson suggested, but his tone carried doubt. They both knew that didn't explain Duke's single-minded focus on Jake, his refusal to leave even when protocol demanded it. As they approached the medical facility, Jake felt consciousness slipping away again. But before the darkness could claim him completely, he felt Duke's weight against his hand one more time, a gentle pressure that seemed to say, without words, "I've got you. You're not alone." The last thing Jake heard before everything went black was Duke's soft whine, a sound of concern and solidarity that would echo in his mind long after his body began to heal. In that moment, suspended between awareness and oblivion, Jake understood that something extraordinary had happened in that smoke-filled training ground. Something that defied logic and protocol. Something that would change everything he thought he knew about loyalty, connection, and the invisible threads that bind one soul to another across the barriers of species and circumstance. The medical tent swallowed him into its sterile embrace. But even there, Duke's presence lingered like a promise that this story was far from over, that this unexpected bond, forged in fire and desperation, was merely the beginning of something that would ripple outward, touching lives in ways none of them could yet imagine. The rescue was complete, but the real journey, the one that would test them all, was just beginning. The sterile white ceiling of the military hospital came into focus slowly, like a photograph developing in reverse. Jake's eyes struggled to adjust to the fluorescent lights, each blink bringing more clarity, and with it more pain. His body felt like it had been put through a meat grinder, every muscle screaming in protest as he tried to move his head even slightly. "Easy there, Zolja," a gentle female voice said from somewhere to his right. A nurse appeared in his field of vision, her kind face framed by dark hair pulled back in a practical bun. "You've been through quite an ordeal. Don't try to move too much just yet." Jake's throat felt like sandpaper as he tried to speak. "How long?" he managed to croak out. "3 days," she replied, adjusting something on the IV drip beside his bed. "You've been in and out of consciousness. The doctors were worried about internal bleeding, but you stabilized. You're lucky to be alive, Specialist Morrison." Lucky. The word echoed hollowly in his mind. He didn't feel lucky. He felt shattered, broken, like all the pieces of himself had been scattered across that Arizona desert, and only some of them had been gathered back together. His hand moved instinctively, searching for something, though he couldn't quite name what. "Duke," he said suddenly, the name coming to him with startling clarity. "The dog. Where's Duke?" The nurse's expression shifted, a flicker of something Jake couldn't identify crossing her features. "The military working dog? He's been quite insistent about seeing you." Created quite a scene, actually. The handler, Staff Sergeant Williams, said they've never seen Duke behave this way. Before Jake could process this information, the door to his room burst open, not with the quiet professionalism of medical staff, but with barely contained urgency. A woman stood in the doorway, her auburn hair wild around her face, eyes red-rimmed from crying. His sister, Emma Morrison. "Jake." Her voice broke on his name as she rushed to his bedside, her hands hovering over him as if afraid to touch, to confirm he was real and breathing. "Oh my God, Jake, they called me, told me there'd been an accident. I drove straight through from Tucson. 12 hours, I couldn't." Her words dissolved into tears, and despite the pain, Jake reached out with his less injured arm, catching her hand. "I'm okay, Em, I'm here." Emma's laugh was watery, disbelieving. "Okay, Jake, you nearly..." "They said if that dog hadn't found you..." She couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't give voice to the alternative that haunted her. "Duke," Jake said again, the name becoming a mantra. "I need to see Duke." Emma wiped her eyes, looking confused. "The German Shepherd? Jake, why are you so fixated on that dog?" "The doctor said you might have some confusion from the head trauma." "I'm not confused," Jake insisted, his grip on her hand tightening. "Duke saved my life, Em. He found me when no one else could. He stayed with me. I need to understand why." The nurse interjected gently. "Visiting hours are almost over, but I can arrange for you to see the dog tomorrow if you're feeling stronger. The K9 unit has been asking about you anyway. Duke's handler says the dog refuses to work properly, keeps trying to get to this wing of the hospital." After Emma left, promising to return in the morning, Jake lay in the darkness of his hospital room, his mind racing despite his body's exhaustion. The pain medication created a foggy distance between his thoughts and reality, but one question remained sharp and insistent. Why had Duke chosen him? Military working dogs were trained to follow commands, to work with their handlers, to follow protocol. Nothing in their training explained Duke's fierce devotion to a stranger, his refusal to leave even when ordered. The next morning brought Staff Sergeant Rebecca Williams, Duke's handler, to his room. She was a compact woman with steel-gray eyes and the bearing of someone who'd seen her share of combat. But there was something softer in her expression as she regarded Jake, a puzzlement that mirrored his own. "Specialist Morrison," she greeted formally, though her tone held warmth. "I needed to see for myself that you were all right. Duke has been difficult since the rescue." "Difficult how?" Jake asked, pushing himself up slightly despite the protest of his ribs. Williams sighed, running a hand through her short-cropped hair. "He won't eat properly, won't focus on training exercises, keeps trying to escape the K9 compound. Yesterday he actually succeeded, and guess where we found him?" She paused, her eyes meeting Jake's, right outside this hospital, sitting at the entrance like he was waiting for someone. A chill ran down Jake's spine that had nothing to do with his injuries. "That's not normal behavior." "No, it's not," Williams agreed. "I've been working with military dogs for 15 years, and I've never seen anything like this. Duke is usually the most disciplined dog in our unit. But something about you," she trailed off, shaking her head. "The brass wants to run some tests, make sure there's nothing neurologically wrong with him. But I think this is something else entirely." Before Jake could respond, a commotion in the hallway made them both turn. The sound of claws scrabbling on linoleum, urgent barking, and multiple voices trying to maintain control. Williams's eyes widened. "That's Duke. He must have broken loose again." The door flew open, and 80 pounds of determined German Shepherd burst through, medical staff and security right behind him. But Duke paid them no attention. His entire focus was on Jake, and the moment their eyes met, the dog's frantic energy transformed into something gentler, more profound. Duke crossed the room in 3 bounds, placing his front paws carefully on the edge of Jake's bed, his tail wagging in a slow, deliberate rhythm. The dog's brown eyes held Jake's, and in that gaze, Jake saw something that defied explanation, a recognition that went beyond the rescue, beyond the training ground, beyond anything that made logical sense. "Duke, down!" Williams commanded, but the dog didn't move. She tried again, more forcefully, but it was as if Duke couldn't hear her. His entire world had narrowed to the man in the hospital bed. Jake's hand moved of its own accord, reaching up to touch Duke's face. The moment his fingers made contact with the dog's fur, something shifted in the air around them. It was like the world had been slightly out of focus, and suddenly everything snapped into sharp clarity. Duke's tail wagged faster, and a soft whine of contentment emerged from his throat. The security guard stepped forward. "Ma'am, we need to remove the animal." "Hospital regulations." But Williams held up her hand, her eyes fixed on the interaction between man and dog. "Wait," she said softly. "Just wait a minute." Jake stroked Duke's head, his fingers finding the familiar contours of the dog's skull, as if he'd done this 1,000 times before. And the strangest thing was, it felt like he had. There was a rightness to this moment that transcended the 3 days since the accident, that reached back into something older, something neither of them could quite remember but both could feel. "This is impossible," Williams murmured, more to herself than anyone else. But even as she said it, she was reaching for her phone, pulling up something that made her face go pale. "Morrison," she said slowly, "when's your birthday?" The question seemed to come from nowhere. "July 15th, 1995. Why?" William's hand trembled slightly as she showed him her phone screen. It displayed Duke's service record, and there in the date of birth field was July 15th, 2015, exactly 20 years to the day after Jake's own birth. That's just a coincidence," Jake said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Is it?" Williams countered. She scrolled down to another entry. Duke was born at the Sierra Vista breeding facility. Where exactly in Arizona are you from, Morrison? Jake felt his world tilting. Sierra Vista. My family lived there until I was 10. The room fell silent except for Duke's soft panting and the steady beep of the hospital monitors. Emma, who had arrived during the commotion, stood frozen in the doorway, her face a mask of shock. There's something else, Williams said, her voice barely above a whisper. She was scrolling through more files now, her movements becoming more urgent. Duke's breeding line. His mother was a dog named Shadow. She was part of the first female canine unit deployed to... Jake, where did your father serve? The question hung in the air like a guillotine blade. Jake's mouth went dry. Afghanistan. He was deployed with the K9 unit. Jake's voice caught. He never came back. His convoy was... We were told there were no survivors. Emma gasped, stumbling into the room. Jake, what are you saying? Williams's hands were shaking now as she pulled up another file. Shadow was lost in the same convoy attack. She was pregnant at the time. The puppies were delivered by emergency C-section at the field hospital. Only one survived. Her eyes met Jake's, and he saw his own dawning realization reflected there. Duke! The connections were forming, invisible threads weaving together across time and circumstance. Jake's father, Thomas Morrison, had been a canine handler. His dog, Shadow, had been his constant companion. And now, years later, Shadow's son had found Jake in a smoke-filled training ground, had refused to leave his side, had crossed every barrier to be near him. That's scientifically impossible, the nurse said, trying to inject reason into the moment. Dogs can't inherit memories or connections like that, but no one was listening to her. They were all watching Duke, who had settled beside Jake's bed, his head resting against Jake's arm in a gesture of perfect peace. Whatever science said, whatever logic dictated, the truth was undeniable in its simplicity. Duke had found his way home, not to a place but to a person, to the son of the man who had been Shadow's handler, her partner, her friend. Jake buried his face in Duke's fur, feeling tears he'd held back for 15 years finally break free. His father's last letter, written the day before the convoy, had mentioned Shadow being pregnant. He'd written about hoping to bring one of the puppies home, to raise it with Jake, to pass on the bond he'd formed with Shadow. That dream had never come true, but somehow, impossibly, its echo had found them anyway. Emma was crying too, sinking into the chair beside Jake's bed. Dad would have loved this, she whispered. He would have said it was meant to be. Williams wiped at her own eyes, professional composure cracking. I need to report this. The brass will want to run DNA tests, verify the lineage, understand how... She stopped, shaking her head. But even if we can explain the biological connection, we can't explain this. She gestured at Duke, who seemed to smile in his canine way, utterly content. The hospital room had transformed from a place of healing into a sanctuary of reunion. Not between strangers brought together by chance, but between families separated by tragedy and time, finding each other again in the most unlikely of ways. Duke's insistence, his refusal to follow protocol, his determination to reach Jake, suddenly made perfect sense. It wasn't training or instinct. It was something deeper, something that ran in the blood and bones, something that transcended the boundary between human and animal. What happens now? Emma asked, her hand finding Jake's free one, the three of them, and Duke forming a chain of connection. Jake looked at Williams, seeing his own uncertainty reflected there. The military had rules, protocols, chains of command. Duke was a valuable working dog with years of service ahead of him. Jake was a soldier, recovering from injuries, his future in the army uncertain. There were 1,000 reasons why this couldn't work, why they would be separated again. But as Duke's warm weight pressed against him, as those intelligent brown eyes looked up at him with absolute trust and recognition, Jake knew one thing with certainty: he would fight for this. For Duke, for the bond his father had started, and that fate, or destiny, or whatever force moved through the universe, had brought full circle. Now, Jake said firmly, his voice stronger than it had been since waking up, we figure out how to stay together. The military bureaucracy moved with all the speed and compassion of a glacier grinding through mountains. 3 days after the revelation about Duke's connection to Jake's father, Colonel Richard Hawthorne sat across from Jake in the hospital conference room, his weathered face carved into an expression of professional sympathy that didn't reach his eyes. "I understand this is an emotional situation. Specialist Morrison," Hawthorne began, his fingers drumming a calculated rhythm on the manila folder before him. "However, Duke is military property, a highly trained asset with years of service remaining. We can't simply reassign him based on sentimental connections." Jake's jaw tightened. "Sentimental? So with all due respect, Duke has demonstrated a unique bond that affects his performance. Staff Sergeant Williams herself said he's been unable to work effectively since the rescue, which is precisely why we're considering retiring him from active service," Hawthorne countered, and Jake's heart leaped before the colonel's next words crushed it. "However, retired military working dogs typically go to law enforcement agencies or their handlers. You're neither, Morrison, and given your medical discharge papers." The words hit Jake like a physical blow. Medical discharge. The explosion hadn't just injured his body. The resulting hearing loss in his left ear and the severity of his injuries meant his military career was effectively over. He was being processed out, deemed unfit for continued service. In any other circumstance, he might have fought the decision, but right now his only concern was Duke. "There must be some protocol," Jake insisted, leaning forward despite the pull of his healing ribs. "Some exception." Hawthorne's expression softened marginally. "There's a waiting list of qualified applicants for retired MWDs, police departments, private security firms, even some therapy dog programs. Duke's pedigree makes him particularly valuable." He paused, closing the folder. "I'm sorry, son. Sometimes fate brings us together with someone only to tear us apart again. That's the military way." After Hawthorne left, Emma found Jake staring out the hospital window, Duke lying at his feet, where Williams had allowed him to stay for a few hours each day. The dog had become a fixture in Jake's recovery, his presence seemingly accelerating the healing process. But now that presence was under threat. "I won't let them take him," Jake said quietly, his reflection in the window showing a determination that Emma hadn't seen since before their father's convoy was attacked. "Jake, you heard what the colonel said. There are rules, procedures." Emma's voice wavered between support and realism. "We can't fight the entire military system." "Dad fought for what mattered," Jake replied, his hand dropping to stroke Duke's head. He wrote in his last letter about Shadow, about how she was more than just a working dog. She was family. He would have moved heaven and earth to bring her puppies home to us. Emma sank into the chair beside his bed, her eyes glistening. "And look where that got him. Dead in the desert with Shadow beside him." The words were harsh, born from old pain. "Jake, I can't watch you destroy yourself fighting a battle you can't win." But Jake was already forming a plan, his mind working through possibilities and loopholes. He'd spent enough time in the military to know that every rule had an exception, every regulation had a workaround. The question was finding it before Duke was reassigned or adopted out from under him. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. 2 days later, a civilian woman appeared at Jake's door, introducing herself as Dr. Sarah Chen, a researcher from the University of Arizona's Animal Behavior Department. She was young, probably early 30s, with intelligent eyes behind trendy glasses and a messenger bag overflowing with academic papers. "Specialist Morrison, I hope you don't mind the intrusion," she began, settling into the visitor's chair with the ease of someone accustomed to making herself at home anywhere. "I heard about your situation with Duke through the military grapevine. I believe I might be able to help." Jake's skepticism must have shown on his face because Dr. Chen smiled wryly. "I know, another academic sticking their nose where it doesn't belong. But hear me out. I've been researching intergenerational trauma and bonding patterns in working dogs. What happened with Duke, his instinctive connection to you, could be groundbreaking. I don't want Duke to be a science experiment, Jake said flatly. Neither do I, Dr. Chen assured him. But what if we could prove that Duke's bond with you is medically beneficial? PTSD service dogs are protected under certain circumstances. If we could document that Duke provides you with therapeutic benefits that no other animal could replicate due to your unique connection. Hope flickered in Jake's chest, dangerous and bright.
You think that would work?
I've successfully argued similar cases before. The key is documentation. She pulled out a tablet already loaded with forms and research protocols. We'd need to establish baseline measurements of your stress levels, sleep patterns, anxiety markers, then document the changes when Duke is present versus absent. Emma, who had been listening from the doorway, stepped forward. What's the catch? Dr. Chen's expression turned serious. The catch is that this takes time. And according to Colonel Hawthorne's office, Duke's reassignment hearing is scheduled for next week. We'd need to convince them to postpone it, which means we need leverage. What kind of leverage? Jake asked, his tactical mind already running scenarios. The kind that comes from public interest, Dr. Chen replied. Your story, Jake, it's compelling. A soldier saved by his late father's dog's puppy. The media would eat that up. And the military hates negative publicity about not supporting veterans. Jake recoiled at the suggestion. I'm not going to use my father's memory for a publicity stunt. It's not a stunt if it's the truth, Dr. Chen countered gently. And sometimes the truth needs amplification to be heard. Your father served his country, so did Shadow. Their legacy deserves to be honored, not bureaucratically dismissed. The internal struggle played across Jake's features. Everything in his training said to keep his head down, follow orders, accept the situation. But everything in his heart screamed to fight for Duke, for this connection that felt like his father reaching across the years to give him something precious. Emma placed a hand on his shoulder. Dad always said the biggest regret isn't what you do, but what you don't do. That evening, as Duke lay beside Jake's hospital bed, the soldier made his decision. Dr. Chen's research proposal was submitted to the Military Ethics Board. A carefully worded press release was sent to local news outlets. And Jake began the difficult process of opening old wounds, sharing his father's story, and explaining why this dog meant more than just companionship. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Local news picked up the story first, then regional outlets. By the next morning, Jake's hospital phone was ringing constantly, and Emma had to run interference with reporters wanting interviews. The hashtag #DukeandJake began trending on social media, with veterans groups and animal rights organizations rallying to their cause. Colonel Hawthorne was not pleased. He appeared in Jake's room the next afternoon, his face red with barely contained frustration. You've created quite a situation, Morrison. I'm fighting for family, sir, Jake replied evenly, Duke's presence beside him giving him strength. Just like my father would have done. Your father followed orders, Hawthorne shot back, then seemed to catch himself. He sighed heavily, running a hand over his face. This isn't how things are supposed to work. There are protocols, chains of command. There's also compassion, Williams interjected from the doorway, surprising them both. Sir, I've been Duke's handler for 3 years. I've never seen him respond to anyone the way he responds to Morrison. If we force a separation, we might lose Duke's effectiveness entirely. But more than that, she paused, choosing her words carefully. We'd be failing to honor the sacrifice of Sergeant Morrison and Shadow. They gave everything for this country. Doesn't their legacy deserve consideration? Hawthorne's expression flickered, a crack in his professional armor. The adoption board meets in 4 days. I can't stop that. But you could recommend a delay, Dr. Chen suggested, appearing beside Williams. Allow time for my research study. Give the board all the information before making a decision. The colonel was silent for a long moment, his gaze moving between Jake, Duke, and the folder of media coverage Emma had compiled. Finally, he nodded curtly. 1 month. That's all I can justify. Dr. Chen, your research better be bulletproof. Morrison, use this time to prove that Duke belongs with you, not just emotionally, but functionally. After Hawthorne left, the room erupted in cautious celebration. But Jake knew this was just the beginning. They had bought time, but now they had to make it count. Duke's tail wagged as if sensing the reprieve, and Jake allowed himself a moment of hope. That night, as the hospital settled into quiet darkness, Jake couldn't sleep. Duke, sensing his restlessness, placed his head on the bed, those brown eyes reflecting the dim light from the monitors. Jake stroked the dog's ears, thinking about his father, about Shadow, about the chain of events that had led to this moment. "I won't let you down, boy," Jake whispered. "Dad saved you and you saved me. Now I'm going to save us both." Duke's tail thumped softly against the floor, a rhythm that sounded almost like agreement. Outside the hospital window, the Arizona night stretched vast and star-filled, holding possibilities and challenges in equal measure. The battle for Duke had just begun, and Jake was determined to win, not just for himself, but for the legacy of love and loyalty that connected them across the boundaries of species and time. The next morning brought new developments. Dr. Chen arrived early with a team of graduate students, equipment for measuring physiological responses, and a thick stack of consent forms. Emma had taken a leave of absence from her job in Tucson to help coordinate Jake's recovery and the fight for Duke. Even Williams, who technically should have remained neutral, found herself becoming an advocate, sharing stories of Shadow and Jake's father with anyone who would listen. But it was Jake's own efforts that surprised everyone. Despite his injuries, he began training with Duke, demonstrating the natural partnership that had formed between them. The physical therapy sessions became joint exercises, with Duke providing stability and motivation. Jake's recovery accelerated, his spirits lifted by Duke's constant presence. The research data Dr. Chen was collecting was remarkable. Jake's cortisol levels dropped dramatically when Duke was present. His sleep quality improved. Even his pain medication requirements decreased. The bond they shared wasn't just emotional, it was measurably therapeutic. Yet challenges continued to emerge. A wealthy private security firm offered a substantial sum for Duke's adoption rights. A police department in California submitted a compelling case for needing his skills. Each new obstacle tested Jake's resolve, but also strengthened his determination. Emma watched her brother transform during those weeks. The hollow-eyed soldier who had woken in the hospital bed was being replaced by someone with purpose, someone fighting not just for survival but for meaning. Duke's presence had given Jake something to live for beyond himself, had reconnected him to their father's legacy in a way that felt like healing old wounds while creating new bonds. As the month deadline approached, Jake knew the real battle was still ahead. The adoption board wouldn't be swayed by emotion alone. They would need facts, proof, undeniable evidence that Duke belonged with him. And Jake was determined to provide exactly that, no matter what it took. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine not just Duke's future, but Jake's ability to move forward from the trauma that had defined his life. The rescue in the desert had been just the beginning. Now came the fight to ensure that rescue was permanent, that the bond forged in smoke and desperation would be recognized and protected by the very institution that threatened to tear it apart. The discovery came on a Tuesday afternoon, hidden in a box of their father's belongings that Emma had kept stored in her garage for 15 years. She appeared at the hospital with the weathered cardboard container, her face pale and her hands trembling as she set it on Jake's bed. "I never looked through these," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "After the memorial service, I couldn't. Mom asked me to take them and I put them away. But last night I kept thinking about Dad's last letter, about Shadow being pregnant, and I wondered if there was anything else we'd missed." Jake's heart pounded as Emma opened the box, revealing stacks of letters, photographs, and personal effects that still carried the faint scent of their father's cologne. Duke, lying beside the bed, lifted his head with interest, as if he too could sense the significance of this moment. Among the papers was a journal, its leather cover worn soft with age and use. Jake's hands shook as he opened it, recognizing his father's distinctive handwriting immediately. The entries were sporadic, written during quiet moments between missions. Reflections on life, war, and the dog, who had become his constant companion. March 15th, 2014, Jake read aloud, his voice catching. Shadow's getting close to her time. The pups are active. I can feel them moving when I rest my hand on her belly. The other guys tease me about being a grandfather, but I don't care. These pups represent hope in a place that's seen too much darkness. I've already decided, if anything happens to me, I want Shadow's puppies to go to Jake and Emma. I've written to Colonel Sanders about it, made it official in my will. Emma gasped. A will, Jake? We never saw any will. The military said Dad had the standard paperwork, but nothing about Shadow or her puppies. Jake flipped through more entries, his sense of unease growing. His father had documented everything, Shadow's pregnancy, his plans for the puppies, even detailed instructions about how he wanted them raised. But none of this had ever reached Jake or Emma after their father's convoy was attacked. May 2nd, 2014. Another entry read, Colonel Sanders seems resistant to my requests regarding Shadow's puppies. Says military property can't be willed to civilians like family heirlooms. But I'm not giving up. These dogs, especially Shadow's offspring, they carry something special. Shadow saved my life twice now, and I believe her pups are meant for something important. Duke whined softly, pressing closer to Jake, as if sensing the emotional weight of the revelations. Jake's mind raced, connecting dots he'd never seen before. If his father had made official arrangements, where had they gone? Why had the family never been informed? There's more, Emma said, pulling out a sealed envelope from the bottom of the box. It was addressed to Colonel Harold Sanders, but it had never been sent, the stamp still affixed to the corner. This was with Dad's things that came back from overseas. With trembling fingers, Jake opened the envelope that had remained sealed for 15 years. Inside was a formal petition, typed and signed by his father, requesting that in the event of his being unable to continue service, Shadow and her offspring be transferred to his family's care. Attached was a medical evaluation from a military veterinarian, documenting Shadow's exceptional qualities and recommending her bloodline for continuation in civilian service dog programs. This never reached Sanders, Jake breathed, the implications crashing over him like waves. Dad tried to protect us, to ensure we'd have part of him even if he didn't come back, but the paperwork was lost in the chaos. Emma's eyes filled with tears, or it was deliberately ignored. The possibility hung heavy between them. Military bureaucracy could be incompetent, but it could also be deliberately obstructive. If Shadow and her puppies were valuable assets, someone might have decided that a soldier's dying wishes were less important than military needs. Jake's grief transformed into something harder, more determined. Colonel Sanders is retired now, living in Phoenix. Williams mentioned it once. He looked at Emma. We need to talk to him. Jake, you're still recovering. The doctor said, the doctors can say what they want, Jake interrupted, carefully swinging his legs over the side of the bed. Duke immediately stood, positioning himself to provide support. This isn't just about Duke anymore. This is about Dad's wishes being ignored, his legacy being buried. I need to know what happened. Dr. Chen, who had arrived for their afternoon session, overheard the exchange from the doorway. If you're going to confront a retired colonel, you'll need evidence and witnesses. I'm coming with you. The drive to Phoenix was tense. Jake's injuries protested every bump in the road, but Duke's solid presence in the back seat provided comfort. Emma drove while Dr. Chen navigated, and Williams, who had insisted on joining them, sat with Duke, her hand occasionally reaching back to steady the dog. Colonel Harold Sanders lived in a modest ranch house in a quiet Phoenix suburb. He was older than Jake expected, probably in his 70s, with the weathered look of someone who'd spent their life in service. His eyes widened when he saw Williams's uniform, then narrowed with suspicion when he spotted Jake, Emma, and Duke. "Whatever this is about, I'm retired," Sanders said from behind his screen door. "I don't handle military business anymore." "This is about Sergeant Thomas Morrison," Jake said firmly, stepping forward despite the pain. "And his dog, Shadow." Something flickered across Sanders's face, recognition, perhaps guilt. He was silent for a long moment before finally opening the door. "You better come in." The living room was filled with military memorabilia, photos of Sanders with various K-9 units spanning decades. Jake noticed one photo in particular, his father, young and smiling, with Shadow sitting proudly beside him. Sanders saw where Jake's gaze had landed. "Your father was a good soldier," Sanders said quietly, settling into an armchair. "Shadow was exceptional. When she was lost in that convoy attack, it was a blow to the entire K-9 program. Why didn't you honor my father's wishes about her puppies?" Jake asked directly. Sanders's jaw tightened. "You don't understand the pressure we were under. Shadow's bloodline was too valuable. After 9/11, after all the deployments, we needed every quality dog we could produce. Your father's request was impractical. Impractical." Emma's voice shook with anger. "Our father asked that his dog's puppy be given to his children, and you decided it was impractical." "There were only 2 puppies initially," Sanders defended. "One didn't survive the first week. Duke was the only one left, and he showed immediate promise. The program needed him." "The program," Jake repeated, his fists clenching. "My father gave his life for that program, and you couldn't honor his one request." Sanders stood abruptly, moving to a desk in the corner. He pulled out a folder, its edges worn from years of handling. "I've carried this guilt for 15 years, he said, handing the folder to Jake. "These are the documents your father submitted. I signed off on them, approved the transfer. But then the convoy was attacked, and in the chaos of the aftermath, the paperwork was lost." "Lost," Williams said skeptically. "Or conveniently misplaced." Sanders' face flushed. Major General Crawford wanted Duke for the program. He was ambitious, saw Duke's potential, and the military's need for quality working dogs. When I brought up Morrison's wishes, Crawford said the needs of the service outweighed one soldier's sentimental requests. He looked at Jake, genuine remorse in his eyes. "I should have fought harder. I should have pushed back. But Crawford was my superior, and I chose my career over honoring a fallen soldier's wishes." The confession hung in the air, 15 years of buried truth finally emerging. Jake felt a complex mix of emotions. Anger at the injustice, sadness for his father's thwarted wishes, but also a strange sense of validation. He hadn't been wrong to feel that Duke belonged with him. His father had intended exactly that. "Crawford is still active duty," Williams said slowly. "He's now Lieutenant General Crawford, head of the K-9 division for all military branches. And he'll be at the adoption board hearing," Dr. Chen added, her face grave. Jake's heart sank. The man who had deliberately ignored his father's wishes, who had prioritized military assets over a soldier's legacy, would be one of the people deciding Duke's fate. The odds had just gotten significantly worse, but Emma was smiling, a fierce expression that reminded Jake of their father. "This is exactly what we needed. Crawford's interference, Sanders's confession, the lost paperwork. This proves that Duke was always meant to be with our family. The military has already denied Dad's wishes once. If they do it again, knowing the full truth, the media backlash will be enormous." Sanders nodded slowly. "I'll testify to what I just told you. It's time to make this right." He looked at the photo of Thomas Morrison and Shadow. "Your father wrote me a letter, one I received after his convoy was attacked. He said that Shadow's puppies carried hope, that they were meant to heal, to bridge the gap between war and home. I think he knew, somehow, that you'd need Duke, Jake, not just as a pet, but as a connection to him, as a way forward." Jake knelt beside Duke, burying his face in the dog's fur. The pieces were falling into place, a puzzle 15 years in the making. His father's love had reached across time and tragedy, had manifested in this living, breathing connection that had found Jake in his darkest moment and refused to let go. "General Crawford won't want this story public," William said thoughtfully. "He's built his career on expanding the K-9 program, on being seen as its champion. The revelation that he denied a fallen soldier's dying wish for personal ambition, that could destroy everything he's built. Then we use that," Jake said, standing with newfound determination. "Not as blackmail, but as truth. The adoption board needs to know the full history. Duke isn't just another working dog being retired. He's the fulfillment of a promise that should have been kept 15 years ago." Dr. Chen was already on her phone taking notes. "This changes everything about my research presentation. We're not just arguing for therapeutic benefits. We're arguing for justice, for honoring military sacrifice." As they prepared to leave Sanders's house, the retired colonel stopped Jake at the door. "Your father would be proud of you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Fighting for what's right, even when it's hard. That's who he was, and that's who you're becoming." The drive back to the hospital was different from the journey there. Where before there had been uncertainty, now there was purpose. The upcoming board hearing had transformed from a bureaucratic hurdle into a chance for redemption, for finally honoring Thomas Morrison's wishes and ensuring his legacy lived on. Duke seemed to sense the shift in energy, his tail wagging with what looked like anticipation. In the rearview mirror, Emma caught Jake's eye and smiled. They had been children when they lost their father, forced to grow up too quickly in the shadow of his absence. But now, through Duke, they were reclaiming a piece of him, fighting for the family their father had tried to protect even in his final days. The revelation of Crawford's interference and the recovered documents had given them a weapon. But more than that, it had given them vindication. Jake's instinctive connection to Duke, the feeling that they belonged together, wasn't just emotion or coincidence. It was the fulfillment of a destiny interrupted, a love that had found its way home despite all obstacles. As the Phoenix skyline faded behind them and the hospital came into view, Jake made a silent promise to his father. He would fight for Duke with everything he had, would ensure that this time Thomas Morrison's wishes would not be denied. The battle was far from over, but now they had the truth on their side. And sometimes, in the face of institutional power and bureaucratic indifference, truth was the most powerful weapon of all. The conference room at Fort Huachuca was sterile and imposing, designed to intimidate rather than comfort. Long fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the polished table where the adoption board sat. 5 officers whose faces remained carefully neutral as Jake entered, supported by a cane, with Duke walking steadily beside him. Lieutenant General Raymond Crawford sat at the center of the panel, his silver hair immaculately styled, his uniform decorated with ribbons that spoke of a distinguished career. His eyes flicked to Duke, then to Jake, and for just a moment, something flickered across his face, recognition perhaps, or concern. Specialist Morrison, the board president, Colonel Margaret Torres, began formally. "You've requested this hearing to contest the planned adoption of military working dog Duke. You may present your case." Jake had rehearsed this moment 100 times in his hospital bed, but now, facing the panel, the words felt inadequate. Then Duke pressed against his leg, a warm reminder of why he was here, and clarity returned. "Thank you, Colonel," Jake began, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "I'm here because Duke isn't just any military working dog. He's the son of Shadow, a distinguished MWD who served with my father, Sergeant Thomas Morrison, in Afghanistan. More importantly, Duke was meant to be part of my family 15 years ago, before bureaucratic interference denied my father's dying wishes." Crawford shifted almost imperceptibly in his seat. Torres's eyebrows rose. "That's quite an accusation, Specialist. Do you have evidence to support this claim?" Emma stepped forward, placing a folder on the table. These are the documents our father submitted in 2014, requesting that Shadow's offspring be transferred to his family. They were signed by Colonel Harold Sanders, but were never processed after the convoy attack that took our father's life. Dr. Chen added her own materials. I've also prepared research data demonstrating the therapeutic bond between Specialist Morrison and Duke, which goes beyond typical service animal relationships. The physiological and psychological measurements show unprecedented compatibility. Torres began reviewing the documents while the other board members leaned in. Crawford remained rigid, his jaw tightening as he scanned the papers that had been hidden for so long. Colonel Sanders is here to testify, Williams added, and the retired colonel entered the room. His bearing still military despite his civilian clothes. Sanders' testimony was damning in its honesty. He detailed the pressure from Crawford to ignore Thomas Morrison's requests, the deliberate suppression of the paperwork, the prioritization of military needs over a soldier's final wishes. With each word, Crawford's face grew redder, his knuckles white as he gripped the table's edge. "These allegations are serious," Torres said when Sanders finished. "General Crawford, do you have a response?" Crawford stood, his voice controlled but tight. 15 years ago, we were in the midst of war. Decisions had to be made quickly, prioritizing operational needs. Shadow's bloodline was exceptional, and Duke showed immediate promise for the K-9 program. The needs of national security outweighed a dead soldier's wishes. Jake interrupted, unable to contain himself. "My father gave everything for this country. He asked for one thing, that his dog's puppy might bring his family some comfort. And you decided your career advancement was more important." "Morrison, you're out of line," Crawford snapped, but there was desperation beneath the anger. "Am I?" Jake challenged. "Or am I finally speaking the truth that's been buried for 15 years? He turned to the board. "Duke found me in that training ground explosion. No one can explain how he knew I was there, how he refused to leave my side, how he's bonded with me in ways that defy his training. But I can explain it. My father loved Shadow. She was carrying Duke when she was lost. Somehow that connection survived, passed down, and brought Duke to me when I needed him most." "That's scientifically impossible," Crawford argued. "Is it?" Dr. Chen countered, stepping forward with her tablet. "Studies have shown that trauma and emotional bonds can affect epigenetic markers. Shadow's experience with Sergeant Morrison, her emotional state during pregnancy, could have influenced Duke's development, combined with pheromones, learned behaviors, and other factors we don't fully understand. Duke's connection to Jake isn't just possible, it's documented fact." She projected data onto the screen. Heart rate synchronization between Jake and Duke, stress hormone reductions, sleep pattern improvements, even brainwave correlations that showed unprecedented alignment. "This isn't about sentiment," Dr. Chen continued. "It's about biology, psychology, and a bond that serves both therapeutic and honoring purposes. Duke with Jake is more valuable than Duke with any other handler or agency because their connection enhances both their lives in measurable ways." Torres studied the data, her expression thoughtful. The other board members whispered among themselves. Only Crawford sat in stony silence, knowing the foundation of his objection was crumbling beneath him. Then the door opened, and an unexpected figure entered. Major General Victoria Hamilton, commander of the entire base. Her presence commanded immediate attention. "I apologize for my late arrival," Hamilton said, taking a seat. "But I felt this hearing required additional oversight." Her gaze fixed on Crawford. "Especially given the allegations of misconduct that have come to light." Crawford paled slightly. Hamilton's reputation for integrity was legendary, and her presence meant this was no longer just about Duke's adoption. It was about accountability for past wrongs. "General Hamilton," Torres acknowledged, "we've just heard testimony about documents that were allegedly suppressed regarding Shadow's offspring." Hamilton nodded. "I've reviewed those documents. I've also reviewed General Crawford's career file. Interestingly, His promotion to Lieutenant General came shortly after Duke entered the K-9 program. Duke's exceptional performance significantly enhanced the program's reputation, which Crawford used to justify budget increases and expansion. The implication hung in the air. Crawford had benefited professionally from denying a fallen soldier's wishes, building his career partially on Duke's success that should have belonged to Jake's family. "This is irrelevant to the current adoption proceeding," Crawford said, but his voice lacked conviction. "On the contrary," Hamilton replied, "it's entirely relevant. We're deciding Duke's future, and that decision must account for past injustices. The military prides itself on taking care of its own. Sergeant Morrison was one of our own, and we failed him. We failed his family. This board has the opportunity to correct that failure." Emma stepped forward, her voice trembling but determined. "My brother nearly lost his life in that training accident. Duke saved him, just like Shadow would have wanted to save our father. This isn't coincidence. This is destiny, connection, love transcending time and circumstance. If you take Duke from Jake now, you're not just separating a soldier from a dog. You're breaking a bond that survived death, war, and bureaucratic cruelty." The room fell silent. Torres exchanged looks with the other board members, excluding Crawford, whose vote was now clearly compromised. Duke, sensing the tension, moved closer to Jake, pressing against his leg in a gesture of solidarity. Finally, Torres spoke. "This board needs time to deliberate. We'll reconvene in 1 hour." The waiting room was torture. Jake paced despite his injuries, Duke following his every step. Emma sat with her head in her hands, and William stood at attention by the door, her faith in military justice clearly shaken. Dr. Chen reviewed her notes obsessively, while Sanders sat quietly, perhaps reflecting on his role in this 15-year saga. Only Duke seemed calm, his eyes never leaving Jake, his presence a constant reassurance. When they were called back, the atmosphere had shifted. Torres's expression was softer, and Hamilton had taken a more prominent position at the table. Even Crawford seemed diminished. His shoulders slumped in resignation. "After careful consideration," Torres began, and Jake's heart stopped. "This board has decided to grant Specialist Morrison's request for adoption of military working dog Duke, effective immediately upon Morrison's medical discharge." Joy exploded through Jake's chest, but Torres held up a hand. "However, there are conditions. Duke will be formally retired from active duty, but will serve as Morrison's registered service animal. Dr. Chen's research study will continue for 2 years, with regular evaluations of the therapeutic relationship. This case will serve as a precedent for future situations involving legacy connections between military working dogs and families of fallen soldiers." Hamilton stood, her voice carrying authority. "Additionally, there will be a full review of the 2014 handling of Sergeant Morrison's requests. General Crawford, you're hereby removed from this board and will face an investigation into potential misconduct." Crawford's face went white, but he said nothing, knowing any protest would only worsen his situation. Torres concluded, "Specialist Morrison, Duke is yours. Take care of him, honor your father's wishes, and let this bond that has survived so much adversity finally find peace." Jake dropped to his knees, his arms wrapping around Duke as tears streamed down his face. The dog's tail wagged furiously, his tongue lapping at Jake's tears, sharing in the joy and relief that flooded through them both. Emma was crying too, her arms joining the embrace, creating a circle of family that had been broken 15 years ago and was finally whole again. Williams stepped forward, formally removing Duke's military harness, replacing it with a service dog vest that read Duke Morrison, Service Dog. "He was always meant to be yours," Williams said softly, her own eyes glistening. "From the moment Shadow carried him through every twist of fate, he was coming home to you." As they left the conference room, Duke walked proudly beside Jake, no longer a military working dog, but a family member reclaimed. A legacy honored, a promise finally kept. The hallway seemed brighter, the Arizona sun streaming through windows, casting everything in golden light. Hamilton stopped them at the door. "Morrison, your father's service will be formally recognized. A commendation for Shadow will be added to the K9 Memorial Wall, and Duke's story will be part of our training program. A reminder that our duty extends beyond orders to honoring the bonds that make us human." Outside, the desert air was sweet with the scent of creosote and possibility. Jake stood with Duke, Emma beside him, and for the first time since the training ground explosion, he felt complete. The rescue had come full circle, from Duke saving his life to Jake fighting to save their bond. "Dad would be so proud," Emma whispered. Jake nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. His hand found Duke's head, and in that simple touch was everything: gratitude, love, connection, and the unbreakable bond between a soldier and his dog, between a son and his father's legacy, between past sacrifice and present hope. The battle was won, but the real journey was just beginning. Together, they would navigate the path forward, healed by the bond that fate, destiny, or perhaps a father's love had forged across time and circumstance. Duke was home, and in being home, he had brought Jake home too, back to himself, back to hope, back to the belief that some bonds are too strong to be broken by death, time, or military bureaucracy. 6 months later, Jake stood in the backyard of the house Emma had helped him find in Sierra Vista, watching Duke chase butterflies through the desert wildflowers that had bloomed after the summer rains. The morning sun cast long shadows across the yard, and somewhere in the distance, a dove called out its mournful song. The physical wounds had healed, leaving only faint scars that Jake barely noticed anymore. The emotional healing had taken longer, required more work, but with Duke by his side, every day brought new strength. The nightmares about the explosion had faded, replaced by dreams of running through open fields with Duke, of his father's smile, of Shadow's gentle eyes. The house was modest, a single-story ranch with a large yard that bordered the desert. Jake had chosen it specifically for Duke, wanting space for the dog to roam and explore. Inside, a corner of the living room had been converted into an office where Jake worked remotely for Dr. Chen's research institute, helping develop programs for pairing retired military working dogs with veterans. The irony wasn't lost on him. The system that had tried to separate him from Duke had inadvertently created his life's purpose. He'd become an advocate, a bridge between the military and families who, like his own, had lost someone but might find comfort in the living legacy of working dogs. Emma pulled up in her car, and Jake heard excited barking as Duke recognized the sound of the engine. His sister had relocated from Tucson, taking a teaching position at the local high school to be closer to Jake. She emerged carrying grocery bags, her face lit with the kind of peace that came from being exactly where she was meant to be. "The Morrison Family Reunion Committee has arrived," she announced, setting the bags on the porch. Mom called. "She'll be here by 4, and she's bringing enough food to feed an army battalion." Their mother, Linda Morrison, had struggled the most with the revelations about their father's wishes and Crawford's betrayal, but she'd found unexpected healing in Duke's presence. The dog who carried Shadow's bloodline, who had fulfilled Thomas's hopes, became a living memorial more powerful than any stone marker. Duke bounded over, greeting Emma with enthusiastic licks and tail wags. She laughed, scratching behind his ears. Yes, I missed you too, you big goofball." The afternoon brought visitors, Williams, who had become a regular presence in their lives, Dr. Chen with updates on their research that was changing military policy, and Sanders, who had found redemption in advocating for change within the veteran community. But the most significant arrival was Linda Morrison. Jake watched his mother step out of her car, her eyes immediately finding Duke. For a moment, she stood frozen, and Jake held his breath, knowing she saw not just Duke but Shadow, not just a dog, but a connection to the husband she'd lost. Then Duke moved forward, his approach gentle and almost reverent. He sat before Linda, his head tilted, waiting. Linda's hand trembled as she reached out, her fingers touching the soft fur, and the tears came. 15 years of held grief finally releasing. "He has her eyes," Linda whispered, and Jake realized she was right. Duke's brown eyes held the same depth, the same intelligence that Shadow had possessed. Thomas would be so happy, so proud. The family gathered on the back porch as the afternoon sun began its descent toward the mountains. Stories were shared. Some Jake had heard before, others new revelations about his father that his mother had kept close to her heart. Duke moved among them, offering comfort where needed, joy where welcome, his presence the thread that wove their separate griefs into shared healing. As evening approached, they lit candles around the memorial stone Jake had placed in the garden. On it was engraved Thomas, Morrison, and Shadow. Their legacy lives on in Duke, in love, in the bonds that transcend time. Linda read from one of Thomas's letters, one that had been found among his effects. "If you're reading this, then I'm not coming home. But don't mourn too long. Find joy in small things, a dog's loyalty, a desert sunset, the love of family. These are the things that matter, the things worth fighting for. Shadow and I did our duty, but our real mission was always to come home to you. If we can't make it in body, know we're there in spirit, in every sunrise you see, in every loyal friend you find." Jake felt Duke lean against his leg, solid and warm. This was what his father had meant. Not just a dog, but a living embodiment of loyalty, love, and the unbreakable bonds that connected them all. Dr. Chen had brought champagne, an unusual choice for such a gathering, but her eyes sparkled with excitement. "I have news," she announced. "The Morrison-Duke case has led to new legislation. The Military Working Dog Legacy Act will ensure that in cases where handlers make provisions for their dog's offspring, those wishes will be honored. We're calling it Thomas's Law," Linda gasped, her hand covering her mouth. Emma laughed through tears. Jake felt his father's presence so strongly in that moment that he almost turned, expecting to see him standing there, Shadow by his side. "There's more," Williams added. "The K9 Memorial at Fort Huachuca is being expanded. Shadow will be honored with her own plaque, and Duke's story will be featured in the Education Center. Every new K9 handler will learn about the importance of honoring these bonds." As night fell and stars began to emerge in the vast Arizona sky, the gathering moved inside. But Jake stayed out a moment longer, Duke beside him. Looking up at the constellations his father had taught him to navigate by during camping trips in this same desert. "We did it, Dad," Jake whispered to the stars. "Duke's home. We're all home." Duke's tail wagged slowly, and in the quiet of the desert night, Jake could almost hear his father's voice. "Well done, son. Well done." The next morning, Jake and Duke drove to the elementary school where they'd been invited to speak. It was part of Jake's new mission, using his and Duke's story to teach children about loyalty, perseverance, and honoring those who serve. The classroom was filled with eager young faces, and Duke immediately became the star attraction. As Jake told their story, simplified for young ears but no less powerful, he watched understanding and wonder bloom on the children's faces. "The most important thing Duke taught me," Jake concluded, "is that love doesn't end. My father's love reached across years and miles to bring Duke to me. Shadow's legacy lived on in her son. And now their story continues through each of you who will remember it." A small girl raised her hand. "Is Duke a hero?" Jake smiled, looking at Duke, who sat patiently beside him, occasionally accepting gentle pets from the children. "Duke is more than a hero. He's proof that the bonds we form, the love we share, can survive anything. He's a promise kept, a family reunited, and a reminder that sometimes the most important rescues aren't about saving lives, they're about saving hearts." As they left the school, Children waving goodbye from windows, Jake felt the fullness of purpose that had eluded him during his military service. This was what he was meant to do: share this story, help other veterans find their own Duke, their own path to healing. The weeks turned to months, and Jake's advocacy work expanded. He spoke at veterans' halls, testified before Congress about military working dog policies, and helped establish a foundation that connected retired MWDs with families of fallen soldiers. Emma managed the foundation's educational programs, and Linda volunteered, finding her own healing in helping others. Duke's presence remained constant through it all. During difficult nights when memories surfaced, Duke was there. During triumphant moments when another veteran was paired with a retired MWD, Duke celebrated alongside them. He had become more than Jake's service dog. He was a symbol of hope, resilience, and the power of bonds that refused to be broken. On the anniversary of the training ground explosion, Jake and Duke returned to Fort Huachuca for a memorial service honoring all the military working dogs who had served. As Jake laid a wreath at Shadow's memorial plaque, Duke sat solemnly beside him, as if understanding the significance of the moment. Colonel Torres, who had become an unexpected ally and friend, approached. "Morrison, I have something for you." She handed him a letter, official military stationery. "It's from the Secretary of Defense. Your father is being posthumously awarded the Distinguished Service Medal. The citation specifically mentions his efforts to ensure Shadow's legacy would continue, his foresight in trying to bring comfort to his family, even in death." Jake's vision blurred with tears. Duke pressed closer, offering silent support. "He deserved this recognition years ago." "Yes, he did," Torres agreed. "But sometimes justice delayed is still justice. And look what that delay created. You, Duke, this movement for change. Your father's legacy isn't just in a medal. It's in every veteran who finds healing through a retired MWD, in every family who receives the comfort of a dog's loyalty, in the law that bears his name." As they stood there, soldier and dog, past and present, merged. Jake could feel his father's pride, could almost see Shadow standing beside Duke. Two generations of loyalty and love united across time. The sun set over the Arizona desert, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Jake and Duke walked together toward the car, their shadows stretching long across the ground, merged into one unified silhouette. Life had brought them through fire and smoke, through bureaucracy and battle, through loss and redemption. But here, in this moment, walking side by side with the dog who carried his father's legacy, Jake knew he had found what he'd been seeking all along. Not just survival, but purpose. Not just healing, but wholeness. Not just a companion, but family. Duke looked up at him, brown eyes reflecting the sunset, and Jake smiled. "Let's go home, boy." And they did, together, as they would be for all the days to come, a bond forged in desperation, tested by adversity, and proven unbreakable by time, distance, or any force that had tried to tear them apart. The rescue that had begun in a smoke-filled training ground had evolved into something far greater, a legacy of love, a testament to loyalty, and a reminder that the most powerful bonds are those that refuse to acknowledge the boundaries between species, between life and loss, between what was and what could be. Jake Morrison and Duke walked into their future, carrying with them the past's precious gifts, memory, love, and the unwavering certainty that some connections are simply meant to be, destined to find their way home, no matter how long the journey or how difficult the path. Dear friends, we hope Jake and Duke's journey has touched your hearts as deeply as it has touched ours. This story of loyalty, legacy, and love transcending time reminds us that the bonds we form can survive even the greatest obstacles. Their tale is just one among many we've prepared to share with you, each exploring the incredible connections between humans and their four-legged companions, between sacrifice and redemption, between loss and healing. If this story moved you, If Jake's fight for Duke resonated with your own experiences of loyalty and love, please subscribe to our channel and leave a like on this video. Every day, we bring you unique stories that celebrate the extraordinary bonds that define our lives. Share your own stories of loyalty and connection in the comments below. We love hearing how these tales touch your lives and spark your own memories. Don't miss our specially curated playlist of similar heartwarming stories about veterans, service animals, and the unbreakable bonds they share. You'll find it by clicking the link on your screen. Each story is crafted to inspire, to heal, and to remind us of the power of love and loyalty in our lives. Join our community of listeners who believe in the transformative power of these connections. Together, we celebrate the Duke and Jakes of the world, the bonds that refuse to break, and the legacy of love that continues across generations. We'll be waiting for you in the comments, eager to hear how this story touched your heart. Until next time, remember, some rescues save lives, but the most important ones save hearts.